Want to come into the parlor?
What are we going to do in there?
Talk about the birds and the bees.
Well, Scooby Doo. You peasant girls don't beat around the bush. Miss Clampett, my lips long to taste your lovely hand.
For 9 seasons, a poor mountain family who struck oil moved into a Beverly Hills mansion and made America laugh harder than almost any show on television. The premise was simple, almost silly, but the people who brought it to life were not simple at all. Behind the banjo-themed song and the cement pond joke sat a cast of war veterans, vaudeville survivors, closeted performers, a near-fatal Hollywood accident, a bitter political feud between friends, and one actor who quietly became one of the wealthiest men to ever come out of 1960s television. When the Beverly Hillbillies premiered on CBS in September 1962, critics dismissed it almost instantly as broad, unsophisticated, even embarrassing. Audiences disagreed. It became the highest-rated news show of its season, and for its first 2 years, it was the single most-watched program on American television, a distinction very few sitcoms in history have ever matched. 9 seasons and 274 episodes later, it left the air in 1971, swept out during CBS's so-called rural purge, when the network canceled almost every country-themed show on its schedule at once, regardless of ratings. What the cancellation could not do was erase the show from the culture. Reruns have played somewhere in the world nearly every day since, and the Clampetts, the Drysdales, and Cousin Pearl remain as familiar to audiences in 2026 as they were 60 years ago. But behind that familiarity is a set of life stories that rarely make it into the clip reels. This is a real story of the Clampett family and the people who played them, where they came from, what the cameras never showed, and where their legacies stand now, in 2026. Christian Ludolph Ebsen Jr. was born on April 2, 1908, in Belleville, Illinois, though he grew up mostly in Florida. Long before Beverly Hills, he was a professional dancer, a genuine hoofer who made his name in vaudeville and on Broadway before Hollywood ever noticed him. That background matters because it explains one of the strangest footnotes in movie history. Buddy Ebsen very nearly died making The Wizard of Oz. In 1938, Ebsen was cast as the Tin Man, not the Scarecrow. The two roles were swapped at the last minute when Ray Bolger asked for the part he wanted. Ebsen recorded his songs, attended rehearsals, and began filming in the Tin Man's aluminum dust makeup. Within 10 days, his body started failing him. He developed severe muscle cramps and could not catch his breath. One night, he woke up gasping, his fingers curled back on themselves, certain he was dying. Doctors eventually determined the aluminum powder used to give his skin a metallic sheen had coated the inside of his lungs, starving his blood of oxygen. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks and spent a month recovering. MGM quietly replaced him with Jack Haley, switched the makeup to a safer paste, and never told the public the real reason Ebsen vanished from production. He always believed the studio doubted he had truly been sick at all. That brush with death shaped the rest of his career in an ironic way. The very thing that could kill him also may have spared him from being permanently tied to a film that took decades to become beloved. For years afterward, Ebsen complained privately that MGM never fully believed his account of what had happened, and he was quietly funneled into a string of lesser films before his contract expired. He spent the next 20 years working steadily but without major stardom, supporting roles, westerns, guest spots, until 1962, when producer Paul Henning cast him as Jed Clampett, the calm, unshakable patriarch of the Beverly Hillbillies. Audiences trusted Jed instantly. He was the still center of a chaotic show, the one character who never chased money or lost his dignity. And it made Ebsen, at 54, a bigger star than he had ever been in his 20s. Ebsen's personal life was less steady than his on-screen persona. He married 3 times, Ruth Cambridge, whom he divorced in 1942, Nancy Walcott, with whom he had 5 children before that marriage ended in 1985, and finally Dorothy Knott, who remained with him until his death. On set, he became a genuine mentor to young Max Baer Jr., and the two stayed close for decades, visiting each other even in Ebsen's final illness. After the Beverly Hillbillies ended in 1971, Ebsen avoided being permanently typecast by launching Barnaby Jones, a detective drama that ran for 8 seasons. He returned to conventions well into his 80s, shaking hands with fans who only ever wanted to talk about Jed Clampett, and by all accounts he never resented it. But Ebsen's story also has a harder edge that fans rarely discuss. In 1984, his real-life co-star and friend Nancy Culp ran for the U.S. House of Representatives in Pennsylvania. Ebsen, a lifelong conservative, recorded a radio ad for her opponent, telling voters he loved Culp dearly, but that she was too liberal for him. Culp was devastated. She called it betrayal and said the man in that ad was not the kindly old Jed Clampett fans believed him to be. The two barely spoke for years afterward, and only reconciled shortly before her death in 1991, by which point, those close to Ebsen said, he privately regretted what he'd done. Buddy Ebsen died of respiratory failure on July 6, 2003, in Torrance, California, at the age of 95, outliving every other credited cast member of The Wizard of Oz. He is buried at Pacific Crest Cemetery in Redondo Beach. He left behind an estate estimated in the tens of millions, built from decades of steady work rather than any single windfall. The man who almost died playing a fictional man made of tin ended up living almost a full century, carrying the damage from that 1938 set in his lungs the entire time. Jessie Irene Noble was born on October 17, 1902, some records list 1903, in El Paso, Texas. Long before she became the shotgun-toting Granny Clampett, she was a child performer. She started working in vaudeville around age 11, in part to help support her family, well before most children her age finished grade school. She spent decades grinding through radio and stage work, including stints alongside Bob Hope, in an industry that routinely discarded women once they passed 40. Her personal life offered little rest. She married Tim Ryan in 1922, a partnership that dissolved under the strain of constant touring by the early 1940s. Her second marriage, to Harold Knox, ended in 1961. She had no children, and colleagues who worked with her often described someone who poured nearly everything she had into her craft. When she was cast as Granny at nearly 60 years old, Ryan brought a physicality to the role that audiences underestimated. She insisted on doing much of her own stunt work, throwing herself into slapstick scenes, climbing, tumbling, riding in barrels, with an energy people assumed only younger performers could manage. Her performance earned her 2 Emmy nominations across the show's run, recognition for a character that could easily have been played as one flat joke, but never was. Off camera, she lived modestly and saved carefully, even as her Beverly Hillbillies salary made her one of the better-paid character actresses on television, quietly building financial security in an industry that had never guaranteed her any after decades in vaudeville and radio where steady pay was rare. Then, in a moment that should have been the crowning achievement of her career, Ryan took on a lead role in the original Broadway production of Pippin in 1972, at age 70. She earned a Tony Award nomination for the role, proof, after 50 years in the business, that Hollywood had consistently underestimated her range. But her body had other plans. During the show's run, she collapsed, and doctors diagnosed an inoperable brain tumor alongside advanced heart disease. She tried to keep performing anyway. Her body would not allow it. Irene Ryan died in Santa Monica, California, on April 26, 1973, at the age of 70. Much of her estate, reported at roughly $2 million, went to fund theater scholarships, a final gesture from a woman whose entire life had been spent chasing a stage. She was only a handful of years older than Buddy Ebsen, but had spent those final months proving, at the height of a serious illness, that she could still conquer Broadway. Doris Ione Smith was born on September 26, 1932, in Pride, Louisiana. She grew up doing hard rural labor. By her own accounts, hauling water before sunrise, long before she ever imagined a life in front of a camera. As a teenager, she married Roland John Bourgeois Jr. in 1949, and the couple had a son, Danny, in 1954. The marriage ended that same year. She later remarried director Robert Leeds, a union that also ended in divorce by 1980. Douglas modeled and worked her way into television before beating out reportedly hundreds of other actresses for the role of Ellie Mae Clampett, the animal-loving, tomboyish daughter whose innocence became one of the show's most enduring images. Series creator Paul Henning reportedly saw exactly the wholesome character he wanted the moment she walked into the audition room, and audiences agreed immediately. Fan letters addressed to Ellie Mae reportedly outnumbered mails sent to any other cast member, and the character became something close to a national ideal of unspoiled, down-to-earth beauty, a role Douglas embraced even as it began to define and confine her professionally. But the role that made her a household name also became difficult to escape. Every audition afterward seemed to run into the same wall. Producers and casting directors saw Ellie Mae and nothing else. Douglas later said the character was both the best and the most limiting thing that ever happened to her career. As acting roles thinned out, she turned toward her faith, becoming a gospel singer, an inspirational speaker, and an author, eventually stepping largely away from Hollywood and returning to Louisiana. She also found herself dealing with legal disputes over the use of her image and the Ellie Mae character in later years, adding stress to a life that had already had more than its share. Douglas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a disease that is frequently caught too late for effective treatment, and her health declined quickly despite her faith remaining steady throughout. She died on January 1st, 2015, at the age of 82, and is buried at Bluff Creek Cemetery in East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. Her estate was estimated at roughly $1 million, modest next to the fame Ellie Mae had brought her, but she had spent the back half of her life deliberately choosing meaning over money. Raymond Thomas Bailey was born on May 6, 1904, in San Francisco. Before he ever became the fussy, money-obsessed banker Milburn Drysdale, Bailey lived a life almost nobody would associate with Beverly Hills financier. As a young man chasing an acting career, he failed repeatedly, took work as a day laborer on silent film sets, briefly held real jobs as a stockbroker and a banker, and then went to sea as a merchant seaman, traveling to China, Japan, the Philippines, and the Mediterranean. He drifted through years of rejection, including a stint working on a Hawaiian pineapple plantation, before finally breaking into steady acting work in his 30s and 40s, eventually landing roles in Incredible Shrinking Man and Vertigo. That long, hard road may explain why colleagues later described him as difficult and exacting once success finally arrived. He married Gabby Ida George in 1951, and the couple remained together for the rest of his life. They had no children. The role of Drysdale, the man forever trying to keep the Clampett fortune and the Clampetts themselves close to his bank, became Bailey's defining performance and earned him 2 Emmy nominations. But as the show entered its final seasons, those closest to production began noticing something was wrong. Bailey started showing early symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, and it visibly affected his performance in the last episodes. After the series ended in 1971, he managed only 2 more film roles, both for Disney, before retiring from acting entirely in 1975 as the disease progressed. He spent his final years largely as a recluse, splitting time between a condominium and a houseboat in Laguna Niguel, California, staying in occasional contact with his former co-star Nancy Culp, whom he had nicknamed Slim. Raymond Bailey died of a heart attack on April 15, 1980, in Irvine, California, at the age of 75. He had undergone heart bypass surgery a few years earlier. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea. It is a strange thing to consider. The man who spent 9 seasons playing the most buttoned-up banker in Beverly Hills had, in real life, been a drifter, a laborer, and a sailor who did not find steady success until well into middle age. Nancy Jane Culp was born on August 28, 1921, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Her path to acting was almost accidental. She earned a journalism degree, then began a master's in English and French, before leaving school during World War II to join the U.S. Naval Reserve, where she served as a lieutenant junior grade and earned several decorations. After the war, she worked as a publicist at MGM, until director George Cukor reportedly told her she was wasting herself behind a desk and urged her to act instead. She made her film debut that same year, appearing later in Shane, Sabrina, A Star is Born, and The 3 Faces of Eve, among others. Paul Henning wrote the role of Jane Hathaway, Milburn Drysdale's fiercely competent secretary, specifically with Culp in mind, and her sharp comic timing earned her 2 Emmy nominations across the show's run. Her marriage to Charles Dacus, which began in 1951, ended within a couple of years, and she had no children. For most of her life, Culp kept her personal life private, In a 1989 interview conducted for the book Hollywood Lesbians, she gave what many read as an oblique acknowledgement of being gay, noting that admitting it after 60 felt like conceding something she had spent most of her life too uncertain to say aloud. The most consequential moment of Culp's post-Hillbillies life had nothing to do with acting. In 1984, after years of working with Pennsylvania's Democratic State Committee, she ran, largely unopposed within her own party, for a U.S. House seat in the state's 9th congressional district against six-term Republican incumbent Bud Shuster. It was always a long-shot campaign in heavily conservative territory. What Culp did not expect was her own former co-star turning against her. Buddy Ebsen, a committed conservative who had sparred with Culp over politics for years on set, recorded a radio ad for Schuster's campaign in which he said he loved Culp dearly, but that she was too liberal for him, and that he had to back her opponent instead. He also donated to Schuster's campaign. Culp called the ad rotten and said Ebsen had no business inserting himself into a race in a state where he had never even lived, especially since the two of them had never been particularly warm toward one another even on set, given their opposing politics. She lost decisively, taking roughly a third of the vote to Schuster's two-thirds. For years afterward, by the account of friends and family, Ebsen was treated as persona non grata in her life, and she asked people not to bring him up except in interviews specifically about the show. She received support during the campaign from friends including actor Ed Asner, but no amount of star power could overcome a heavily Republican district that had not sent a Democrat to Washington in over a decade. The two former co-stars eventually reconciled, but only shortly before her death, and Ebsen reportedly carried private regret about the ad for the rest of his life. After the campaign, Culp returned to academic life, teaching and staying connected to the arts. She was diagnosed with cancer in 1990 and died on February 3, 1991, in Palm Desert, California, at the age of 69. She is buried in Mifflintown, Pennsylvania, near her family's roots, and her headstone bears the name Miss Jane Hathaway, a tribute to the role that made her famous, even after everything else she had accomplished in a life that included wartime service, a journalism degree, and a real run for Congress. Harriet Elizabeth McGibbon was born on October 5, 1905, in Chicago. Her father's early death pushed her toward financial independence rather than comfort, and she found her footing in theater, working her way through stock companies and eventually earning solid Broadway credibility starting in the 1920s, including a run in You Can't Take It With You. Decades later, television work followed, including guest appearances on Bewitched, before she landed the role that made her most recognizable, Margaret Drysdale, the icy, status-obsessed wife of Milburn Drysdale, whose disdain for the Clampetts sharpened the show's class-based comedy. Her personal life carried real weight of its own. She married producer William Kahn in 1930, had a son in 1933, and divorced in 1942. That same year, she married writer Charles White, and the marriage lasted until his death on Christmas Day, 1967. A decade later, in 1977, her son died before her, a loss from which those close to her said she never fully recovered. Friends described